introduction. I'm afraid I can't quite live up to the expectations it creates. But I thought I would say a little bit anyway about my experiences of trying to help in the formation of policy and in trying to help in the implementation of policy. And then I suspect that the most valuable thing actually is to have a conversation. I talk about whatever it is that interests you in this domain. So I'll be relatively brief, and we can spend the maximum amount of time in the conversation. I apologise that we've got a vote at 7, so I'm going to have to leave around 6:45. I think the first thing I want to say is that nobody knows the answer to the question, how should you go about the business of formulating and implementing policy, because circumstances change and the nature of governments change as the political system delivers different kinds of government. And people try things and they work to varying degrees, and then they try other things. So I hope that if you take anything away from this session, you will take away the point that there is no sort of simple rule. You can't get a recipe which will cook you the perfect souffle in policy terms. It just isn't that way. So I can't give you a sort of, here's how you do it talk. Second thing I think I'd say is that it also very much varies by field topic. So bless you. It's a very, very different thing to think about what we think about in the National Security Committee when we're trying to adopt and modify strategies for global politics and peace and war, than it is to work out how to improve the planning system so as to get more homes of a good kind built for more people in the United Kingdom. These are obviously very, very different kinds of things. So, second thing I'd ask you to take away is, as well as there being no sort of simple set of guidelines or rules that deliver you the perfect policy in a nice little package, the way you consider policy making has to vary very much with the topic you're dealing with. Above all, it has to vary with the extent to which you are actually at all in control of events. No government is ever wholly in control of anything. No set of human beings are ever wholly in control of anything. But obviously you're much more exposed to the winds of fate and fortune in the international sphere than you are domestically. All sorts of things happen around you, and a large part of the time you have to respond to them. Now it happens, of course, domestically too. We've just been through some very serious floods. We didn't want them, we didn't design them, we didn't make them happen. We had to respond to them. So there are things which are purely matters of response domestically too, but there are things that are more under your control more of the time domestically. The next thing I think I want to say is that policy for any government that's at all serious, and most governments of most political complexions over time are serious. I may or may not agree with what they particularly wanted to do, but in general they're composed of serious people who are trying to do something serious. And under those circumstances, policy doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a general agenda. Our system is one in which, not always, but very often, I think I could almost say usually, that agenda is set at the beginning of the parliament in question by the manifesto of the party that has come to office. That is the point of manifesto. I don't know whether I'm going to be cruel enough to ask whether anyone in this room has actually ever read a manifesto, but if you have, you are very unusual. Most of our fellow citizens do not ever read manifestos. They have other things to do with time. Actually, I'll let you into the secret that I don't think very many journalists ever read the whole of the manifesto either, including those who report on them. They tend to be quite long and quite detailed, and people pick things out of them rather than reading them on the whole. So you might ask, why do you bother? Why not just make a press release of the things which you think are going to get picked out first? And part of the answer is that actually the manifesto of the party that happens to win a general election is a very, very important document when you get into government, because if it's been well done at all, it sets out the agenda of that party in a way that creates a framework for thinking about particular policies, and indeed will tend to specify a number of particular policies, at least at the high level of generality. I say this is usually the case because actually, personally, I obviously in the last Parliament, not this one, lived through coalition, and under circumstances of coalition, of course, there are two manifestos. In our case, there was a Conservative manifesto and a Liberal Democrat manifesto, and so you couldn't be governed by one or the other. You had to be governed by something else, and so we sat down and negotiated right at the beginning. In that case, Danny Alexander and I negotiated a programme for government, which was tried to take large sections of our manifesto, the Liberal Democrat manifesto, and try to work out how you could do something which either achieved what they were each trying to achieve in a slightly different way, or which combined the two, or which achieved what one was trying to achieve with the trade-off of another being achieved somewhere else that came from the other party. So we ended up with something called the Programme for Government, which was in effect an after the election manifesto. But whether it's that way, or more usually in our system, the manifesto of the party that's got a majority in Parliament and is governing the country, that sets the framework of thought. I think the next thing I want to say is that there's an awful lot of difference between a statement of a general kind that you tend to find in a manifesto and the level of detail you need to get to if you're going to turn that statement of intent into reality. Now, of course, even when you're writing a manifesto, you do an awful lot of work to try to get behind the general statement. You need to be able to answer questions during a general election campaign, which is a very vigorous affair, about what is behind the statement. You need to be able to defend why you've adopted that general policy rather than others. So a lot of work goes into this. But nevertheless, once you come to try to implement what is in your manifesto, you encounter a huge number of much more detailed questions about what this general statement means. So if I give you an example, if you say that you are going to give tenants of housing associations the right to buy their homes, as we said in our last manifesto, and then you come into office and that's what your manifesto says, and so that's what you want to do, and that's part of the general agenda to give people greater opportunities to own their own homes in Britain, then you have to work out in detail how are you going to deliver this. And that brings me to the next point, which is, I think all governments to some degree, but certainly in recent years we have more and more discovered that the answer to the question, how are you going to do this, is much more complicated than it might at first appear. So I think that some academics, for example, have sometimes portrayed this process as if it were a question of having a general policy like that in the manifesto, and then drafting a law, and then passing the law through Parliament, and then sitting back and getting on with the next thing. My experience is very different from that. To begin with, in the case of the particular policy that I talked about, the right to buy for tenants from housing associations, actually what happened was that Greg Clark, the Community Secretary, had various discussions with those of us who were involved, and he came to the conclusion that actually he would prefer, if possible, to do a deal with the housing associations and get them to sign up to, get them to agree to a voluntary agreement about how we're going to do this. And he succeeded in negotiating that. So actually, although there is a piece of legislation, it's not the legislation which governs the implementation of policy, it's the voluntary agreement. So there, the details, and it's very detailed, there's a big document, the voluntary agreement, goes through all sorts of questions about how does it operate and what happens if and so on. That document was drawn up between Greg and the housing associations in a series of elaborate negotiations. That leads, in turn, the method by which you've implemented, the method by which you've carried the policy into reality, leads in turn to quite different kinds of implementation challenges. So in that case, because the housing associations have signed up to the agreement, it falls to them actually to implement it. So our role becomes to check whether they are implementing it and to make sure that if somebody is trying to buy their own home, they can exercise the right in a case of a particular housing association. But we don't have to do a whole series of other things. Whereas obviously if you are implementing a policy either by issuing an order or direction of some kind that you have the power to do, or passing a law or whatever, then the government, and having gone through the process that's required, has also to work out exactly how to implement it. And there are cases between these two. So there are plenty of cases in which we've come to the conclusion that actually the best way to get something to happen is to not to legislate, not to regulate, not to create a mechanical process like an agreement or whatever, but to nudge, to give people an incentive in a certain direction. That again leads to a different form of implementation, because if you're giving people an incentive, obviously you're not then forcing them to do it, so you don't have to send in the police or the inspectors or the regulators. You have to observe whether they're doing it and see whether you want to adjust the nudge. So I think the penultimate thing I want to say is implementation entirely depends, the nature of the implementation depends on the way you have taken the policy and turned it into something real. The last thing I want to say is that I think that over many, many years and decades, and probably, certainly in all the other countries I've worked in with governments of various kinds, being true, it's certainly true here, the business of formulating an agenda and specifying some policies at a general level and working out how to put them into practice, all of that side of the thing is much better developed than the art, and it is an art, not a science, of trying to work out how to make sure that the thing you intended to achieve is achieved by the policy, and trying to find out how you can find out whether what you intended to achieve by the policy is being achieved by the policy. And the reason I say that is partly just the experience we've had, and I think previous governments have had, about how difficult it is just to get to grips with what is really happening as a result of something you have done. And partly because actually some of that is to do with lags in time. The national statistics tell you a lot about what's happened, but they tell you it about 2 or 3 years after it's happened. So there's not very much use if you're implementing a policy and you discover the effects of some previous policy 2 or 3 years ago. You want to know in more or less real time what's happening, so you have to develop means of doing that. And then, if it's going wrong, you have to work out how to respond to that. And all of that, I think, is at the leading edge, so to speak. Most of my attention at the moment is spent trying to work out how we ensure that the things we thought we were trying to achieve, we really do achieve, rather than some other set of things we didn't intend to achieve, by trying to develop better methods of finding out what is actually happening on the ground quickly, and then working out how to respond to that and adjust things so you try where it isn't going right to get it to do what you were trying to do in the first place. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Because time's a bit short, Kieran, I'm going to ask you to do the Q&A. If you can do 3 questions at a time.
Yep. Well, thank you for that very much, Mr. Letwin. I'm sure we all really enjoyed that. I particularly enjoyed the part about the nudging. Actually, I found that very interesting. So we'll just quickly go through the questions. So the first 3 questions first, please, and then we'll have the next 3 questions after. If that's okay with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Letwin, for giving up your time to speak to us today. My question is, given your time and experience in politics, what has been the major changes in policy planning, and how have you adapted to them?
Mm-hmm. You want me to do this in 3s?
If you can.
Right.
Hi, Mr. Letwin, thank you for being here today. I would like to ask, how would you say think tanks influence our political system and influence policy in particular?
Thank you, Mr. Letwin, for your time today. So who do you think are the key influences when it comes to government policy?
Okay, well, let me take the first one and then separately the second two, which have a lot to do with one another. This will sound very odd, but actually in my experiences there hasn't been much change. Circumstances change, so particular policies change quite a lot. And of course different governments change policies quite a lot. But the process, I don't think is very, very different. And actually, not only do I not think it's terribly different across the last 30 or 40 years in the UK, but to give you an extreme example, when I was advising Fidel Castro, who's rather different from the current UK government, in a rather different set of circumstances, which is not a democracy, or indeed when I was working for President Yeltsin in Russia, which is again a very different sort of circumstance, my experience was it was remarkably similar. So indeed talking over recent years to counterparts in the Indian and Chinese governments, which have very different problems from ours, and much, much greater in scale. Again, actually when you get underneath the skin, you try to understand what's really going on. Of course there are huge cultural differences, but actually underneath, because we're all human beings and we all have somewhat similar problems and concerns, actually at root, tends to be a remarkably similar set of processes you have to go through, even if the results are very different in different places. Think tanks and influencers. I think my honest answer to the question about think tanks, which is in part a negative answer to your question about influencers, is that there have been a few occasions on which I've been aware of a think tank saying something which some while later becomes accepted and done, and you can trace it back to the think tank. But actually, I think there's sort of fingers of one hand numbers of those that I'm aware of in my own experience. I think what the think tanks do much more, and this brings me to the general question of influences, is to enlarge the area of the possible. If they're doing their job right, they raise issues that people have ignored, or they raise possibilities that people have dismissed. And at first, the reason why those haven't happened from politicians is that they seem zany or highly controversial, plain mad. And then after a few years of people discussing them, they no longer seem so mad, and people begin to wonder whether actually they might be sensible, and then eventually maybe the whole atmosphere changes. I think that's what I'd say about influences, that actually, although it's certainly political parties, at least here I'm speaking of our system, it would be even truer of the Communist Party in China, but of our system it's certainly true that the political parties are the main influences on policy, and it's the thinking inside political parties that matters. I think incidentally political parties are the least studied parts of constitutions. People talk about them as if they were kind of not part of the constitution, but actually they really are, in the sense that that's really where politics sits. But what influences a political party to go in this direction rather than that direction, partly of course is the leader. Leaders are incredibly influential and important. But also this question of what seems possible. And I think it's the sort of atmosphere that emanates from academics and serious commentators in the media and think tanks that creates the sense within a political party gradually that you might do this rather than that. And that gets people thinking, and then the political party takes over and the party mechanics become the way that the agenda gets set. And then finally, of course, for the detail of how it all cashed out, which is, as I've been trying to say, incredibly important, there I think the civil service is the most important influence. Because you have I can't remember what it is now, but 500,000 civil servants or something, and less than 200 ministers. Well, the ministers are not going to be able to deal with all the detail. So once the agenda has been set by the party and the ministers are translating it into a broad pattern of action, it's the way that gets refracted through the civil service system that actually ends up by being a determinant of where you get to. I don't know whether that answers both questions about. I hope that I was answering your question about change, although I accept it was a sort of negative answer.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Can we have the next 3 questions, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. Letwin, for your time. I would like to know, how have circumstances and events changed government policy since your appointment in 2010?
Mr. Letwin, thanks again. That was very useful. To what extent do you think evidence and empirical data drives the creation of policy versus ideology?
Mr. Letwin, thank you so much for taking the time out this evening to speak to us. So you've mentioned think tanks and the importance of political parties. So my question is, how can campaigning organisations best influence or impact policy ideas, change, and their implementation?
Very interesting questions. Let me start with the second question of evidence and ideology, and come back to the question of circumstances of campaigning organisations. I think the way I would describe it is this, but I'm sure you get quite a different answer from other people. By ideology, which is not a phrase I normally use, a term I normally use, I take it what you mean is a set of political ideas.
That's right.
Yeah. I think what that does is to formulate the overall agenda. So the reason why the Labour Party manifesto or the Conservative Party manifesto, whatever it might have been at the last election, was as it was because we, or colleagues in the Labour Party, whatever, had a set of political ideas and we tried to incorporate them. That's not based on evidence, that's based on ideas. Ideas about what, based on general understanding of where the country is, what direction we want to take the country in, and what does that mean. But then you come to the question, okay, so we want to take the direction of increasing people's opportunities by improving their schooling, or enabling them to buy homes when they couldn't otherwise, or enabling them to free themselves from drug and alcohol addiction, or mental health problems, or breakthrough into professions that they're barred from, or whatever it may be. So our manifesto is a manifesto in great part about opportunity. Now you ask the question, how do you achieve any one of those things? But you want to improve schools, particularly in inner city areas where many of them have been very much less good than we wanted them to be. Well, that's a great statement, but how do you make that happen? Well, one of the things, obviously, I'll just take a tiny example, is helping children to read and write. It's a very important thing. That's where I think the evidence needs to come in. Because having decided that you're going to spend a lot of money or spend a lot of time or change structures to enable the children to be better taught to read and write, you need to know what is actually going to have that effect that you're going to spend your money on, time, whatever, hire people to do. And that's why we set up a whole series of network of things called What Works centres, which are little bodies of people, experienced academics in the main, who spend their time, that's what we ask them to do, accumulating evidence of which techniques for example, this is literal, for example, helping people to read and write, have actually in practice worked. Obviously, sometimes that's easy to find out, and sometimes quite difficult, but that's what they're doing. And they're taking all the academic literature and all the research studies that have been done anywhere in the world, and they're looking at these things and they're saying, okay, does this work or does that work? And sometimes it's the answers to these questions are very counterintuitive. You might think that something, anybody would know that X turns out to be quite untrue. Actually, it doesn't. It's something else that achieves the effect you want better. And the only way you can find that out is with evidence. And so you have to try things or look at other things that people have tried elsewhere or at other times, whatever, and measure those things. And I think the right mix, therefore, is agenda based on ideas about what you're trying to achieve, followed by implementation, which is guided by the evidence about what actually works. That brings me to circumstances and events changing policy. I mean, I think the answer is they change policy inevitably because you can't ignore events and circumstances. But if your government is properly organised and it has a clear idea of what it's trying to achieve, the kind of change that's brought about by a change in circumstance or events is not that you ignore it, which would be stupid, nor that it completely puts you off and you tear everything up, but rather that you work out, okay, if I was trying to achieve X, on the assumption that the event is not so cataclysmic that I've given up trying to achieve X, and if I'm trying to, I don't know, enable children to be better taught at school, I'm not going to give that up because of some event, that's sort of abiding interest or passion. So now I discovered that it's more difficult to do that for the following reason than I thought it was going to be. The question you then should ask yourself in policy making, it seems to me, is if that's the case, and I can't just do what I was going to do for some reason, how do I find a way around that that gets the same result? So my answer is that mostly events and circumstances should change your approach to achieving something which in itself is not changing. Which takes us on to the campaigning organisations. I mean, campaigning organisations have a very considerable influence. And not all of them, not all of the time, but some of them, some of the time, do make a big difference. I'm going to say something which you may think is hopelessly naive, but my view is that does not generally depend on the sort of number of members they have, or how loud they shout, or how many newspapers they occupy. There can be examples of that. But mainly, I think it depends on the extent to which they develop really powerful arguments, and the extent to which they understand what the general ambitions of the government are, and find ways of explaining to that government why those ambitions ought to include what the campaigning organisation wants. So basically, if a campaigning organisation comes to me and says, well, you know, I think everything you think is wrong, and I think everything your government's trying to do is wrong, and I think you should do this, I smile sweetly and offer them some coffee, and no more happens. They may succeed in getting some other government elected, but they're not going to persuade us to do something exactly opposite of what we're trying to do. But if they come along and say, you've been trying to achieve this, and actually you haven't noticed this, and if only you did, you realise that we should do this, and here's a very good research paper that explains why, and while we're at it, we've got 10,000 outlets and 400,000 members, and they're all interested in this, well then you sit up and think, well actually are they right? So it's persistence and intelligence and constructing arguments and being sufficiently able to adapt to the government in question that matters. I'll give you a very direct example. I am about later this evening after the vote in the House of Commons to go to the ceremony about protecting our oceans, and at that there will be campaign groups who persuaded me 2 or 3 years ago that we should take really seriously as part of our agenda of biodiversity the proposition that the British overseas territory waters that surround Pitcairn and the Ascension Islands, which are enormous, should be protected so that the fish and fauna and so on that subsist there would be protected as a huge contribution to the ecology of the world. I would never have adopted that strategy had it not been for a combination of the campaigning groups and some colleagues from Parliament coming along and saying this is something you really need to do and here's why. Now, of course, they latched on to the fact we had already a biodiversity agenda. They weren't proposing something ludicrously expensive. We didn't have very much money at the time. You didn't have very much money. We weren't able to take very much money from the people to spend on things, so we could only do things that were relatively cheap. And it had to be done in a sensitive way that respected the interests of people who were on these islands. So they had thought through all that. They came with a rational, worked-out proposition, and blow me down 3 years later, we have actually managed to do that. Or anyway, almost completed doing it. So I think that's what I would say about the campaigning organisations. They can be hugely effective when they approach things that way.
Unfortunately, time's running out.
Sorry.
So I'm actually going to do the final question myself, if I can have
Sure.
permission. So the final question, what do you think are the top 3 qualities that you need as a person to design and implement policy in government?
I have no idea. I think part of what I'd say is that actually this is completely a team game. There's no area of government policy that's simple enough for one mind to grapple with alone. And therefore what you actually need is a group of people who have different talents and different backgrounds and different understandings and different kinds of knowledge who can talk together in an open textured way and actually do very, very much better than the sum of the parts. And I think therefore actually rather than formulating three desiderata, I'd formulate one. Actually, to manage that, what you need is the ability to get a lot of people together and get them to think together, but not to engage in groupthink, but to be themselves and think the way they think and contribute and debate it out until you have finally got to a position. And actually, my experience is that, for example, that is what makes really good prime ministers. It's where they're able at the end to make an incredibly difficult decision. We'll do this rather than that, where it's terribly difficult to know what to do. But in the meanwhile, they've listened to a range of people who knew what they were talking about and organised them to think about it in a way that means that they're getting the benefit of all that experience, wisdom, understanding and so on, rather than just trying to do it on their own.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, please give your appreciation to Mr. Oliver.